Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we're in the ship's post office down here on second deck, and we're going to be talking about the right to vote, in particular mail-in voting. Wartime laws tend to limit personal freedoms. We've seen this a lot in the last couple of decades, especially around the War on Terror. However, the right to vote has greatly benefited from laws passed during wartime, or as a result of wartime. Initially, the right to vote was limited to white citizens of the United States over the age of 21. The Founding Fathers thought it was imperative that voters be old enough to make an informed decision. The first real contest to this came during the Civil War. Initially, voters would have to vote in person, and the number of Americans drafted into service during the Civil War meant that a huge part of the voting population was off at war and unable to vote. At that time, several measures were taken to try and give Civil War era soldiers the right to vote, whether pollsters went out to units in the field. And it was sort of easy during the Civil War because units tended to be arranged by home locations. For example, regiments were formed in specific states and then carried their state's name and number with them. So you knew that the 20th Maine Regiment came from Maine and were all citizens there who were registered to vote there. So you could go out and collect polls there, or early mail-in balloting attempts were made at that time. All of these initial measures went away after the war. But following the war, during Reconstruction, black males who had American citizenship and were over the age of 21 were granted the right to vote in 1870 by the 15th Amendment. While the federal government gave the citizens the right to vote, individual states still had a lot of power when it came to allowing people to cast ballots. And so many southern states came up with poll taxes, which voters were required to pay in order to be allowed to vote, or private citizens simply prevented their neighbors from voting through intimidation tactics and other violence, whether threatened or actually carried out in many cases. So even though more people than ever were getting the right to vote, in theory, it wasn't actually true in many places.
There is no constitutional issue here. The command of the Constitution is plain. There is no moral issue. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
During World War I, the right for soldiers to cast mail-in ballots was not considered. The United States was not involved in World War I for a particularly long period of time, only a little over a year. So even though there were elections in 1918, soldiers in the field were not given the right to vote. However, women did support the war effort in a number of ways and in large numbers. And they were able to use this as one of the arguments that led to women gaining suffrage in 1919 when the 19th Amendment was ratified. So at that point, men and women, black and white, who were citizens and over the age of 21, were allowed to vote. World War II would vastly increase people's right to vote, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But first, let's talk about the Vietnam War. Remember, up until now, you had to be 21 years of age or older to be considered mature enough to cast a ballot. In the Vietnam War, the argument was made that we were able to send 18-year-olds out to fight, but they couldn't drink and they couldn't vote yet. And so a large movement was formed to try and lower the voting age to 18. And in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed, which granted the right of all citizens over the age of 18 to vote.
On Independence Day. And it seems to me that it is particularly appropriate that on this same day we are certifying the 26th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. That amendment, as you know, provides for the right to vote of all of our young people between 18 and 21. 11 million new voters as a result of this amendment that you now will see certified by the GSA administrator.
So, back to World War II. World War II saw an unprecedented 14 million Americans in uniform, many of which ended up deployed overseas. And so during the war, the debate as to whether these men and women should be allowed to vote occurred more than once, actually. First, in 1942, leading up to the 1942 elections, Congress debated giving the right to vote to soldiers. And believe it or not, there were a number of arguments against this. For one, it was feared that they would vote exclusively for their commander-in-chief, who at this time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had already served an unprecedented 3 terms. For another, there was concerns that ballots could be sent to troops out in the field. Obviously, there were far more important things to mail, and there was a question as to every single county has different ballots based on who they're voting for. So do you just send out a blank ballot that then the voter has to know who is running for every seat in their county? I'm a fairly well-informed voter, and I've already cast my ballot this election cycle, and I couldn't tell you who was running for even the congressional seat that represents me, much less any of these other positions. So there was double fear that soldiers would only vote would vote only for the president who they had known for the last decade or so, the bulk of any given soldier's lifetime. So there was fear that was going to impact the elections. And there was also opposition from the Southern Bloc that black soldiers would not have to pay a poll tax and could therefore cast a ballot. And so many Southern congressmen voted against allowing this. In the end, in 1942, for the interim election, a balloting system was created and sent out so that soldiers could cast mail-in ballots. But it had less than 30,000 participants out of millions of soldiers in uniform at that time. So it was fairly unsuccessful. And following that election, the law that allowed it expired. So a new law had to be created for the 1944 elections, in which President Roosevelt was up for his 4th presidential term. Again, the debate raged back and forth for many of the same reasons we've already discussed. And in the end, the way that the federal government was able to pass this law was by giving authority to come up with the particulars to each of the state governors. They could either send out the blank federal ballots, which required you to know all the candidates and write in, which 20 states did choose, or they could mail out their own ballots and collect their own poll taxes and whatnot. In the end, less than 3.5 million soldiers cast the vote, roughly 1/4 of men and women in uniform at that time. However, the precedent was established to cast mail-in ballots. And that precedent has continued on to this election cycle in 2020, when we are casting mail-in ballots to an unprecedented degree in this country. Thank you guys for watching. Remember, tomorrow is Election Day, November 2nd, 2020. If you have not cast a mail-in ballot yet, please go out and vote. I don't care who you vote for. Please get out there and perform your civic duty. If you voted while you were in the military, tell us what your experience was like in the comments section down below. The Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial receives operational support from the New Jersey Department of State. If you would also like to support the museum and our YouTube channel in particular, check the link to our GoFundMe in the description below. Thanks for watching.